Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive interviews with leading experts every weekday here on Arabiya English. I'm Tom Burges-Watson. Coming up on today's program, all eyes on Hamas. How will they respond to President Trump's proposal to end the war in Gaza? And what will Israel do next if they reject it? Plus, we'll be getting a check of some of the top stories in the United States, where it's day 2 of a government shutdown, and where the US Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth addressed top brass earlier in the week and told them the military had lost its way, it needs a shake-up. And as well as that, he said some in the ranks need to get in shape. Well, we ask, how's that all gone down, and has he got a point? Hello and welcome. The civilian death toll in Gaza continues to rise. This as Hamas weighs its response to President Trump's peace proposal. Well, at least 13 Palestinians are reported to have been killed in the Gaza Strip as a result of deadly overnight Israeli strikes. Well, so far, Hamas has called President Trump's proposal, his 20-point plan to end the Gaza war, a bitter choice, and one, they say, that ignores the interests of the Palestinian people. Well, let's get more. We can speak now to Ahmed Al Khatib, who is a senior fellow and director for Realign for Palestine at the Atlantic Council. He joins us now from Washington. Thank you very much indeed for joining us here on Arabiya English. There is a report doing the rounds that the head of Hamas's military wing in Gaza, a man by the name of Izz al-Haddad, opposes this 20-point framework put forward by President Trump. Does that sound credible to you?
Well, I can imagine there's some truth to that, because after all, the guys with the guns are the ones that are calling the shots in Gaza. The ones with the guns want to ensure that they're not left totally exposed by the process of disarmament, by the process of allowing an external security force coming in. We've seen reports of the groups attempt to distinguish between offensive and defensive weapons, as they've labeled them, indicating that they want to retain some capability for pushing back against efforts to forcibly remove them, perhaps. We've seen chatter on social media, in Arabic news and elsewhere, in officials that I've spoken to, that Hamas is actually still opposed to the principle of an international security force coming into Gaza and effectively replacing the Israeli military presence. They view that as some form of an external occupation. While we've also seen reports of other members of Hamas who are desperate for the war to stop. They feel the pressure from the Arabs, from their own population in there. They're out of options. They're out of financing. They're out of any real leverage to try to end the Israeli onslaught. The hostages, of course, are their only remaining leverage. And so there really is a split that both is emerging now as a result of the negotiations, but has always been there consistently throughout the war, and indeed throughout Hamas's history, between the hardliners often found in the military wing versus those who are a bit more pragmatic, if you will, that are found in the Politburo, particularly those who are in Doha.
Okay, so Ahmed, basically, the man we mentioned at the beginning, al-Haddad, is one voice. There are other voices who suggest there are splits in the ranks of Hamas. But does one person have the final say? And if so, who is that one person?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, Hamas has been splintered into many bits and pieces after 2 years of warfare, after the elimination of most of their frontline commanders, senior commanders, military and political, inside the Gaza Strip. So what remains of Hamas are a bunch of disparate cells in different parts, and they're technically under a broad, let's just call it a ethos-based umbrella of Hamas. However, Izz al-Haddad very much so has the influence as the sole legitimate authority within the terror organization, within the armed wing of Hamas. And so, of course, he's going to have oversized influence that outmatches and outshines that of the political echelons outside of Gaza. I don't foresee, even if Hamas abroad agrees to the deal, I don't foresee them being able to impose it upon those inside Gaza, particularly those who control the hostages, the cells that control the hostages. And if Ezzeddin al-Haddad has control and dominion over these cells, then he ultimately is the decider. The other component to think about is that the vast network of tunnels that exists in Gaza, that not only is the IDF, the Israeli military itself, unaware of fully, but even most remaining members of Hamas, they had such a high degree of compartmentalization that many of them don't even know the full extent of it. So he might be one of the last senior leadership within Hamas to know the full extent of the tunnel network, such that he could potentially try to hide some of the group's weapons in there and do a ceremonious surrender ceremony to the media and to the cameras, but
Right.
actually retain some of the group's weaponry. So he is definitely somebody not to be underestimated.
Right, and Ahmed, you make an interesting point there, because that also raises questions about the hostages. Because if Hamas has been so splintered, and we imagine that the 20 surviving hostages are being held in different places, it may be that some units of Hamas don't know who's holding which hostages, and maybe that does mean that some of the hostages could never be found. I mean, is that a possibility, do you think?
Well, that actually is the biggest concern that many in Israel and the United States have, both in terms of it being a reality that it may take more time than 73 hours or 72 hours, rather, 3 days for Hamas to produce the hostages once the deal is in effect. So there's a tactical consideration of it, but then there's a strategic consideration, which is that Hamas might very well be able to play a game and say, oops, we've lost contact with some of these hostages, as they've done in the past, as a way to claim that we have no idea where one or two or five living hostages went, along with several bodies, such that they could retain them as a policy, insurance policy, as leverage to ensure that the deal proceeds accordingly. And we got to keep in mind that Hamas's biggest concern is the timeline for the withdrawal, and how that time of Israeli military units throughout Gaza, the three lines that we saw the White House and Mr. Trump release, and how that is tied to the entry of the International Security Force. And so is this regional stabilization force going to be stood up and ready to go in a month or two, or is it going to take 6 months? If it takes 6 months or 8 months, then I see no reason why Hamas would accept the deal as is, because that means basically surrendering their main leverage, their only leverage, and then sitting idle under siege by the Israeli military for that long, waiting for an international security force, during which the war could resume, during which battlefield conditions could change. And so the hostages remain the biggest obstacle. And I've seen some try to maybe even push for 5 days for Hamas to actually produce some of those hostages. So that is definitely a point in the deal to look out for when it comes to Hamas's response and reply, and whether they'll say yes, but, and I expect one of the buts to be about needing more time to locate the hostages.
Because Ahmed, just to pick up on that point, because that's really important, your hunch, and you know these matters better than anyone, is that a yes, but is the likely response to the 20-point plan, not an outright rejection and not an outright acceptance. Is that what you're saying?
Indeed, I do not think that Hamas has the guts, if you will, to say outright no. They know that the Arabs have put a lot of capital and time. Mr. Trump and the Trump administration have put a lot of capital, making Netanyahu apologize to Qatar, producing that security pact with the Qataris yesterday. There's so much hanging in the balance right now that for Hamas to be identified as the the boogeyman, if you will, by saying no. It's just out of the realm of possibilities. I do not, even if they say no, they will say no indirectly. So what I suspect they'll do is they will come back with reservations, as they call it, or attempts to modify the clauses as they relate to the timeline for the release of the hostages. They want the withdrawal of Israeli tanks and military units from Gaza to be linked to the release of hostages rather than linked to the entry of a security force. They're going to want the distinction between the offensive weapons and defensive weapons. They're not going, because basically they're going to want to retain their status as a resistance group, Hamas and others. And what's been interesting is how Hamas is basically going to be using other factions like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, PFLP, Palestinian Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Marxist-Leninist group, to say, well, these guys are saying they want to remain in Gaza, when in fact that Hamas is just using them as a vassal, as a proxy, as a vehicle. And so then there's the issue of Hamas doesn't feel it's appropriate to allow outsiders in the form of the international security force to come in and then accept the departure of terror leaders and members of the terror group who choose not to commit to peace, as we saw outlined in the plan. And so those are the primary terms that I think the group is going to insist on modifications. My assessment, and that of folks that I'm speaking to and that of folks who are involved in this matter, is that the administration, the US administration, and certainly the Israelis have very little margin for renegotiation. It's a very much so a take it or leave it. There's a small margin for clarifications here and there, but a fundamental rework is out of the question. And so my concern is that I don't see, as of now, and I hope I'm wrong. I pray that I'm wrong. I'm from Gaza. I have surviving family members there. I have siblings there. I lost a lot of my family there. So I have a personal stake in this matter. But my personal hunch and assessment right now is that Hamas will not accept the deal, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, we did hear President Trump say a couple of interesting things, actually, about, the rigidity of this 20-point plan. When he was asked about room for negotiation, he did say there wasn't much room, but he didn't say there was zero room. So it's not 100% set in stone with that 20-point plan. And the other thing is the deadline itself isn't that precise. It was sort of 3 or 4 days, I think, to quote the president. So it doesn't really pin them down to, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday. It's not quite clear, is it? That struck me as quite interesting.
Yes, exactly. I mean, and this is where, as much as President Trump was playing hardball with Hamas, and I think many parties are very nearing the point of no return in terms of they're tired, they're exhausted, 2 years, and this deal and that deal, and yes, Israel is certainly a party to this, and Israel has had its own role in maybe hindering the reaching of an agreement perhaps earlier. And I understand for a fact that President Trump exercised maximum pressure on Bibi Netanyahu, Israeli prime minister, over the last week to get him to agree to the plan and to the framework, especially the point when it comes to the full abandonment of any talk of forced displacement, the Gaza Riviera that gave life to a lot of the far-right elements of Netanyahu's governance coalition, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, many of whom have been quiet. They've been talking behind the scenes, but they've been publicly quiet because they've all understood that the United States forced basically Israel and the Israeli government to come to the table. And so I believe that Mr. Trump is determined to let the deal go as is. However, I also know that he invested a lot of political capital, and he might be convinced by Doha in Qatar and maybe Egypt to a lesser extent that if what's a few more days to really make sure that your investment is not lost in vain. And therefore, I do expect some flexibility, especially with the Jewish high holidays in motion right now. There might be little room for going back to the Israelis and trying to really iron out some of the details because of Yom Kippur and some of the other high holidays. So we shall see, but I predict that we're not quite at the point where Hamas is ready to deliver a response, and we're not quite ready at the point where the president is going to throw in the towel. Well, throwing in the towel in this case will have deadly consequences for the people of Gaza. Nevertheless, this is it. There's no other plan. There's no other push for the end of the war. There is no more negotiations. What happens beyond this, and this is what terrifies me, but this is the reality, is that there will be a blank check for Israel to basically proceed into annihilating Hamas, however they see fit. And that timeline could very well extend into next year until the next elections. We're a year away from the elections for Israel's, in which Netanyahu could conceivably either lose his premiership or win a second mandate. And so we could be looking at another year of deadly war that will be disastrous for the people of Gaza. And that's where I expect the Arabs will apply maximum pressure in both directions to give this a little bit more time.
Okay, well, we really appreciate you speaking to us. Thank you very much indeed, Ahmed Al Khatib. Thank you for your time, sir. Now, the Trump administration is moving to revamp the military. Earlier on this week, the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth gathered the top U.S. commanders at a Marine Corps base in Virginia, outlining new directives, including, in his own words, tougher gender-neutral fitness standards, an end to woke culture, and zero tolerance towards fat troops. Let's take a listen.
Frankly, it's tiring to look out at combat formations, or really any formation, and see fat troops. Likewise, it's completely unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon and leading commands around the country and the world. It's a bad look. It is bad, and it's not who we are. So whether you're an airborne ranger or a chairborne ranger, a brand new private or a four-star general, you need to meet the height and weight standards and pass your PT test.
Pete Hegseth speaking there. Well, he also argues that many officers have been promoted on the grounds of their race, gender, or what he calls historic firsts. Well, he insists that the era of political correctness must come to an end.
This administration has done a great deal from day one to remove the social justice, politically correct, and toxic ideological garbage that had infected our department, to rip out the politics. No more identity months, DEI offices, dudes in dresses. No more climate change worship. No more division, distraction, or gender delusions. No more debris. As I've said before, and will say again, we are done with that.
Well, joining me now to discuss all of this, Malcolm Nance, a former U.S. intelligence officer. I'm also joined by Jack Posobiec, who's a U.S. veteran, Republican political operative, and author of Citizens for Trump. Thank you both very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Jack, let me start by asking you. We just heard some clips of the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth there, talking to hundreds of generals and admirals in Virginia on Tuesday. He said the military had lost its way. It needs a shake-up. Amongst other things, he said it's too woke and too fat. Has he got a point?
Well, look, I think this was the best speech the U.S. military has heard since General Patton. I mean, standards need to be uniform across the force. And whether that be a person of any background regardless of what position you're in, you need to meet the standard. That is what military excellence is all about. This is not a partisan issue. Everyone should be held to the same standards, and that kind of excellence can be returned through the national security gains for the American people. Look, and he talks about people being overweight. We had General Milley, who you can't find a single picture of this guy ever doing physical fitness, doing any PT. And it's real simple. A fat general can't march, and a fat admiral is going to sink the ship.
Okay, plenty to get us started with. Malcolm, feel free to respond to that. I just want to ask you as well how these comments by Pete Hegseth have gone down. I mean, he was, after all, talking to the top brass, wasn't he?
Yeah, he was talking to the top brass. And right next to every admiral or general, there was a person like me. I was senior enlisted, a senior chief petty officer. That is one step below sergeant major. And they had all the sergeant majors of every command there. We are the people who have to understand and respond to those standards. Let me put something very clear. All right. I spent 20 years in the Navy. My family put 152 years in the armed forces of the United States collectively. That was one of the most ridiculous speeches ever done. It was not equal to Patton. It was not equal to General Schwarzkopf's character and competence. It wasn't even equal to the rank of major that he had. He was lecturing people that had the combined experience of 64,000 years in the armed forces. That was 1,600 people with 20 years experience. Setting a standard is one thing, but to have a guy who never met the standard himself, well, then all he's going to do is degrade the force.
Okay, Jack, lots for you to react to there. I mean, has Malcolm got a point? These were generals and admirals being addressed by a man of 45 who made it to the rank of major. Did he strike the wrong tone?
Well, I was listening to Malcolm's retort there, and I couldn't find him actually make any substantive disagreements with the speech. He made a lot of personal attacks, but at the end of the day, it was all about applying standards. And that's right. Those standards should be applied to the war secretary as well as his command, as well as his staff. If he's going to be setting standards, he absolutely should follow them. And I'd more than you see him do that, by the way, all the time. He goes out, he does the PT with his troops. He's there all the time with people when he goes and visits. Anytime he conducts a visit, he's out there doing the PT. So when it comes to holding yourself to the standard, I think he's done that. I think he's been doing that. If he didn't do that for one day, I'd certainly be the first one to say something. But at the end of the day, this is about applying uniform standards. And we all know, you can just look at a picture of General Milley and say, you know something, we've gotten away from our standards. I also like the fact now, Malcolm and I, we're both sporting beards right now, but this is something that's gotten a little bit out of hand in the military, where people are getting beards all the time. Grooming standards have gone down. And I liked what he said. I appreciate what he said about that it starts with the little things. It starts with the little standards: physical fitness, grooming. If I was in uniform, I'd have to shave the beard. That's just what it is. My hair, I'd say Malcolm and I's hairs are about uniform standard right now. But again, this is part and parcel of being in the military, holding yourself to the standard. So when Malcolm said he agreed with that, I would say I agree with him.
Okay, Malcolm, I mean, lots to talk about here. I mean, this issue of weight and fitness, very much the headlines from all of this. So let's stay with sort of the weight and fitness dimension. I mean, he said it's unacceptable to see fat generals and admirals in the halls of the Pentagon. Let me put it to you, Malcolm. Shouldn't those people be setting an example?
Well, sure, they should be setting an example. But I just want to call attention to some things that perhaps the Secretary of Defense, right, by legislation, he is the Secretary of Defense, seems to miss. One, he has never been pregnant. And we have a force in which we have women who are skilled professionals who carry out their operations, who during pregnancy may gain a little weight. We have people who are on profiles because of medical disabilities. We have soldiers who are going through cancer treatment. That can add up to 30 pounds to you. General Milley, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. If you look at his chest and his shoulders, he ran some of the largest special operations units in American history. He met the physical standard at that time. We have generals right now who can go out and PT with the best of them. But you know what that's not doing? It is making China laugh at us while they outpace us in shipbuilding, while Pete Hegseth goes out and does PT for an hour in the morning, poorly, I might add. and tries to worry about what we look like. We are not here. The U.S. Armed Forces has never been an armed forces of marching and look. It has always been a force of professionalism and lethality. And what he's playing is a Fox News host game, when at a time we need to make sure that our force is actually professional. And what he wants to do is he wants to cut this out. I don't know, take us back to a world before 1948 where there are no blacks, there are no women, and there are no Asians, and make our force not leaner, stupider, younger, in a world where a guy who's 45, 50 kilograms can wipe out a special forces platoon with a PlayStation drone handle.
Okay, Jack, I mean, feel free to comment on anything that Malcolm's just said there. And I also want to ask you, are there really so very many overweight officers out there? I mean, apart from General Milley, I mean, no one seems to have come up with any other specific examples here.
Oh, I could find you plenty of examples. You just there's entire Facebook pages that are dedicated to this sort of thing, and whole TikTok video. When I was in, it was more Facebook, but nowadays TikTok, you can find it all over the place. Video after video of this, which I'm really confused why we even allow TikTok, by the way, used in so many military installations. Malcolm mentioned China, and I think that's a great example. I also agree that China is our biggest near-peer competitor when it comes to that. And having both served in the Navy, we really look to the issues that 7th Fleet is having, the mishaps that we've been having in 7th Fleet. And this starts at the lower levels. It starts at the deck plate level. If you're taking care of yourself, if you're not taking care of yourself, how can you take care of your ship? If you're not taking care of your ship, how can you take care of your fleet? If you're not taking care of your fleet, how can you defend against China? Look, China maintains rigorous fitness standards. I've focused on China. That was my main focus when I was in there. And they maintain those standards like clockwork. And if anyone has a problem, they will get booted down. All we're doing is saying we're going to get back to the fighting stance that America was in. Look, go back to World War II. Go back and look at those guys when they were signing up, when they were going on the Navy ships over to fight the last Asian power that we fought in the Pacific, which of course was Japan. You don't see too many fat guys when you're looking at the storming the beaches of Iwo Jima and Guam and some of the other island hopping, Saipan and others. So I think it really actually is all about taking care of ourselves and maintaining those standards from the deck plate level on up, so that we're making sure that we're paying attention to detail, and we're using that attention to detail not just on ourselves, but in our work and others. It's about creating that culture of excellence. And by the way, that includes anyone who is welcome to join in that culture of excellence, regardless of background. All you got to do is meet the standard.
Okay, what's the counter argument here, Malcolm? I mean, it is about the little things, isn't it? It's sort of a bit like the broken window theory, that if you overlook the little things, everything gets a bit sloppy, and that goes against sort of military discipline and military training in most countries, doesn't it?
No, sure. That's a standard. And we have all met the standards of uniform and discipline. That's why we're in the armed forces. That's why we can do what we can do. But, if you look back, his argument about World War II, the median age of survival was 65 years old. The average person there had a body fat of like 9 or 10% because they had just come out of the Great Depression. You can't put the standards of 2025 to a standard from 85 years ago and expect these things to change. We have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who come from a world where they have less education. They come from a world where they have a fatter diet because of the way that Americans eat. It's different in Europe as well. But I have had when I was in the Ukrainian army, I had fat 60-year-old Ukrainians, right, win the Hero of Ukraine award. We had drone operators who were 19 years old with 5% body fat, right, racking up kills by the hundreds. This is a different world. And for the fact that Pete Hegseth, a man who never met the standard, right? This guy shouldn't be in the job. He's not qualified. He was picked out of a TV show lineup because he looks like he's the kind of guy. He's talking about, removing, listening to the wisdom of E6s as opposed to the E7s, 8s, and 9s, my rank area, where we are the solid body of all knowledge in the armed forces, and ignoring the 32,000 collective years of generals. This guy should never has been chosen for the job. And the fact that he chose to focus on this disobeying the laws of war, relaxing the rules of engagement so that we can go out and kill, for a president that has said that they are going to start withdrawing from Asia and the Pacific and focusing on bringing the armed forces to American cities. This shows you this White House, this Secretary of Defense is lost. He doesn't even know what the job is.
Okay, Jack, how do you respond to that? And also picking up on this next sort of chapter of the discussion, which is the rules of engagement that Pete Hegseth talked about, and making soldiers more lethal. I think he used the word increasing their lethality. What are your thoughts on that?
I couldn't agree more. Increasing lethality is the entire primary purpose of having a standing army. You can go all the way back to the days of the initial debates about this with Washington and Jefferson and Hamilton, and sort of the questions about whether or not we should have a standing army. And that, of course, is the purpose, the defense of the homeland, the primary purpose of that. And yes, of course, you will need a military that is able to carry out that mission, both with the technological ability and on the ground ability. If you're sending in, a QRF, you're sending in a SOF unit, you want to make sure those guys are the best of the best, and that their support staff, from the logistics to supplies to medical to all the intelligence all the way down, are also the best of the best. And that certainly starts with holding a standard. And so this is something where I'm afraid I can't let it go. We need to maintain the standards. The standards have gotten lax. We've seen mishaps in 7th Fleet in the Asia Pacific region, and we've seen mishaps in other places. Certainly the biggest, of course, being the disastrous withdrawal of Afghanistan, which did take place under General Milley. And I think it's a cop-out to say that there's no connection here between the lax standards and these unfortunate military scandals, failures, and mishaps that we've seen in the prior administration. It's just as simple as that. And now, so you mentioned sort of change the subject back towards rules of engagement. Look, it's very simple. The rules of engagement of the United States military, defense of the homeland, is written right into the Constitution.
Okay, but just staying with you, Jack, what's your understanding? I mean, is that maximum lethality more of a kind of kill now, ask later approach? Is that what it is?
Well, I'd like to define the parameters of what exactly we're talking about. Certainly the military has a range of options that are available, and certainly different missions depend on different things.
Okay, but what I was talking about is when Hegseth said, no more politically correct, overbearing rules of engagement, just common sense, maximum lethality. I mean, Malcolm, what's your interpretation of that?
Let me tell you something. I've served in the armed forces of 2 nations, right? With exception right now, the eastern battlefront of Ukraine, which has, without any question, the greatest lethality on this planet right now in practice, mainly because of their drones and the skill of the Ukrainian army as they've developed over 3 years. The United States Armed Forces is the single most lethal force on this planet. And it's not because of PT standards. It's because the 3 things that Pete Hegseth seems to hate: the diversity of the force and its thought, the equality of those soldiers, and knowing that each of them meets those standards and will be judged by those standards and will be respected for what they bring to the force, right? The inclusion of all thoughts, minds, ranks, and positions into the fighting force and bringing that to the battlefront. That is where America's lethality has been traditionally since the founding of this nation.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, let me turn to you, Jack. I mean, one thing we heard Pete Hegseth say there in Virginia was soldiers, officers who disagree with what he said there should, quote, do the honorable thing and resign. I mean, what's been the reaction? Do we expect a backlash here and a spate of resignations?
No, I don't think you'll see resignations. I mean, when someone's been in that long, they're really focused on their pension. They're focused on their career afterwards. So their prospects regarding the Rolodex, defense contractors, these types of things, the types of positions that they'll get. But at the end of the day, here's what it all comes down to. When you have a standard of lethality, that should be first and foremost. I want my military to be the most fearsome, terrifying fighting machine on the face of the planet. And you know why? The more terrifying my military is, the more terrifying and scared the rest of the world is of my military, the less chance that anyone is going to pick up a gun or a boat or a missile or a bomb or whatever it is and try to come after my family, my wife, my children. That's the purpose of my military. And so that's why I support Pete Hegseth, because I want my military to terrify the rest of the world from even thinking about messing with the United States of America.
Okay, Jack Posobiec, thank you very much indeed for your time. Thanks to our other guest as well, Malcolm Nance. Thank you both very much indeed. Now, it is Thursday, and as ever on a Thursday, we get a check of some of the top stories in the United States. And joining me today is Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Mackey, a friend of the show. Amanda, great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us.
Great to be with you, Tom.
Thanks. Just before we crossed you, we were talking to a couple of guests there about the comments made by Pete Hegseth, the U.S. Defense Secretary, who seems to think that U.S. soldiers need to clean up their act, brush up their act. They're getting sloppy and they're overweight. How's this all gone down in America?
Well, definitely you have people on both sides here. So you definitely have people who feel like, maybe people don't have a leg to stand on when they look at who makes up the cabinet, for example. They look at who or what senators look like on the Republican side and say, these guys are overweight. How come weight is now an issue? I think the reality is that somewhere in the middle is a good place, but I happen to agree with Pete Hegseth. And I think a lot of the older members of the military would say, so what would now be considered veterans, would say that, they came in under very different rules than perhaps they have now in the last 15 years for soldiers, airmen, sailors. It's a different set of circumstances that they have to be a part of. So in other words, it was a lot harder back in the day, and the physical endurance and the strength testing and the PT and all of those things were a lot harder than what people have to do now when they enter the military. So in other words, they've relaxed the rules a little bit. Now, if you look back on what happened during the Biden administration, you were seeing men who were soldiers cross-dressing, literally dressing up as women and then posting those on social media. And I think that needs to absolutely stop. And I think that's where Pete Hegseth's going, not just with the weight, but really cleaning up the act of the military so that they act like the military that we've always known and loved here in the United States.
But do you think there's an element of people who are saying, Pete Hegseth got the tone wrong? I mean, he's 45 years old. He's addressing admirals, generals, people with a lot more experience on this planet, not to mention military experience, because he only made it to the rank of major. And there he was addressing these, senior figures. And in some, articles, it's being said that he addressed them like children. I mean, do you think he got the tone a bit wrong?
I think that he is the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, and so he outranks them. I worked in the Pentagon, and I worked for someone who was the Army General Counsel. So when he was in the Army and he separated from the Army, he was only in 03. He was, or in 04, I believe he was a major. But the point is that when he was in the Pentagon as the Army General Counsel, he had 4-star status. And so there was definitely a point where someone would say, well, you only, were in 04 or 03 in the military, and now you have this status of 4 stars, but that's the rank that he has. He outranks them. He has the ability to dictate the rules coming from the president or in conjunction with the president. And so I think a lot of people looked at it as, wow, there's, 50, 60, 70-year-olds, clearly people older than him sitting in that audience with many more years, decades of experience. However, he is the Secretary of War, and he is putting out these mandates, and they have to comply, or else they need to find other jobs or retire.
Okay, so is there a sort of a public perception out there in America that the generals perhaps aren't quite as in shape as they ought to be, and then they need to lose a couple of pounds? Is that a sort of a widely held perception, would you say?
I wouldn't say say it's the generals so much as it is how the military's changed over the last decade or so, where they have just relaxed the rules and relaxed the standards. It was a lot more difficult, some would say. I did not serve in the military, but people would say it was a lot more difficult. And then, during the conflicts that we've had in the last 15 years, they have been more engaged in recruitment, and recruitment sometimes means relaxing standards, and they want to come back to traditional standards. Of course, insert that with the Biden years and the Obama years, where they did allow, as I mentioned before, where you had people that were members of the military posting on social media that they are cross-dressing or doing different dances. I mean, just things that are out of sort for the military and what most people don't associate with the military.
Okay, so it looks like there's going to be a bit of a revamp of old-fashioned standards and getting the soldiers back in line in the United States.
That, but also I would say the timing of this happens to coincide with a government shutdown here in the United States. Right. So that obviously affects the military. So the focus may be shifted immediately to when are people in the military going to get paid. So people didn't so much worry about what Pete Hegseth said, other than the sound bites that we saw. People more focused now on what happens with the government and when are we going to reopen.
Right. Well, you've leapt on to the next topic I was going to ask you about, which is, of course, the shutdown. Day 2, 750,000 federal employees have been sent home without pay. President Trump meeting his budget chief, Russell Vought, today. And I just wonder, what is the latest overall on this issue? Does it look like there could be an impasse?
It looks like both sides are digging in their heels. And it's really amazing to me. And of course, I come at it from a perspective of objectivity, if I can be honest, and say this is a bill that has been passed 16 times with Democratic support. They are literally continuing the government on what we call a CR, a continuing resolution, which just means at the same numbers that we've voted for 16 times already, just most recently in March, we're going to continue the government at those levels. That is going to take us through to 7 weeks from now, right before Thanksgiving. And so, late November. And so that's what the Republicans are asking Democrats to support in order to get through a government shutdown so that federal workers can go back to work. And yet the Democrats are digging in their heels on various provisions. That's really meant for a larger, broader bill. If you're funding the government for 7 weeks, you don't need policy changes. In fact, you don't want policy changes because guess what? This is what happens. You have a government stalemate and a government shutdown. You have these two parties that are not willing to negotiate right now because they are so dug in. And the Republicans are saying, we have a 24-page bill you voted on 16 times. And Schumer said he's not going to hold up the government last March on this very same bill, yet you are stopping the government from working because you want to push other provisions that we should decide in a much larger and broader bill where we make policy changes. So I think that's the big issue right now, is that the Democrats have basically dug in. Republicans feel very confident in their position. 63% of Americans want the Democrats to support the Republicans in continuing the government. I think what's important here to remember is that this always comes down to elections. And we have a governor's race in New Jersey this year, next month. That means early voting has already started. But more importantly, we have a race in Virginia, which is much of Northern Virginia tends to house a lot of the federal workers who are now sitting at home furloughed. So the state of Virginia has about 300,000 federal workers of the 750,000 that you mentioned. Now, not all of them are in the DC area, but 300,000 of them live in Virginia, and they are voting for their next governor right now. They started voting September 19th. So I think we may see an outcome of what actually happened with this shutdown in the form of 2 elections in New Jersey, but more importantly, in Virginia.
Now, we've heard from the president on this issue, and since the beginning of his term in office for the second term, he's made no secret of his desire to cut down on unnecessary expenditure as he sees it, and perhaps lay off people whose jobs aren't entirely necessary, and he believes they're costing the country too much money. And he heard him saying that this shutdown is actually what he called an unprecedented opportunity. And I just wondered what to read into that, because I'm just wondering whether that means perhaps he'd like to see some of these temporary freezes to headcount being made permanent. Is that one interpretation of it?
I think that's accurate. I think what he's looking at are jobs that are no longer relevant, perhaps, in the federal government is very clunky. It's very hard. Civil servants have a lot of protections in their jobs, but perhaps President Trump and Russ Vought are looking at ways to cut these ancillary jobs that they believe are maybe either redundant or are obsolete, no longer relevant, or don't fit within the mission of President Trump and his administration. That's entirely up to him if he wants to do that. Now, we saw that happen a little bit earlier in the year with what Elon Musk was doing with Doge and trying to clean up government waste, fraud, and efficiency. And so certainly there are going to be jobs that can be looked at as being inefficient and no longer necessary. And where that hurts the Democrats is that a lot of these civil servants, I would argue most civil servants, are Democrats. And so you kind of gave President Trump and his team an opening to go in and take those jobs and say, these aren't relevant anymore. So it created a problem not only for the Democrats on that front, but I think also, again, talking about just how the perception has been of this. I think the Democrats are losing when it comes to the perception argument to the general public. How is this being perceived? It's being perceived that Democrats are stopping the Republicans from trying to continue the government at current levels. And then you're giving President Trump an opening for him and his team to be able to cut jobs, which he believes is in the best interest of taxpayers, given these are taxpayer-funded jobs. And so it creates a worse situation, worse dynamics, definitely for the Democrats than for the Republicans.
Okay, now, Amanda, you mentioned a name that we haven't heard for a while. We used to talk about Elon Musk quite a lot a couple of months ago, not quite so much lately, but he's back in the headlines. I mean, it's been a real roller coaster of a year for Elon Musk, some real ups and downs, but there's an up that we can discuss. Elon Musk is the first person ever to surpass the $500 billion mark in terms of his net wealth. I mean, that's a cause for some celebration, I'd imagine. What's behind this?
Well, I mean, he's heavily invested in various aspects of the economy. And obviously, he's someone who has worked hard to get to where he is. And I think a lot of people, certainly during the campaign, he was able to inspire a lot of youth, just the way, Charlie Kirk did. You could say he is inspirational because a lot of the youth look to him as, I want to be like him. And so what he's been able to do, I don't know that it's definitive that he is out on top right now, because I think it's been between him and Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle. But nevertheless, he's a very wealthy man, and he's been using his money to influence politics in the last at least year, if not year to 2 years, if not longer. But really what we've seen of him in the last 2 years has been really a dynamic where he shifted all his efforts to help President Trump get elected, especially after President Trump was shot last July in Butler, Pennsylvania. He really said, the gloves are off. I'm coming out and I'm going to support him, even if it means it could be detrimental to the assets that I hold and the companies that I'm a part of. And certainly it did have an impact when he and President Trump parted ways, when he went after President Trump on certain things, certain policies that he didn't like. It did have an adverse impact on him, but obviously, as we're discussing, not that adverse, because he still seems to be leading, if not at number one, he's in the number 2 spot in the world as the wealthiest man in the world.
Yeah, I mean, we heard President Trump talk about Elon Musk a couple of months ago. I think he described him as being 80% genius, 20% problems. I mean, that's not entirely, that doesn't sound like a personal attack. I mean, we've seen the two men together as well, haven't we, at a public event? I mean, is there a sense that the two men have sort of patched things up?
I really hope so. And I think a lot of people, while we were all mourning and grieving what happened with Charlie Kirk at his funeral, I think a lot of people, the takeaway was also, wow, maybe in his death, Charlie Kirk was able to bring these two individuals back together once again and reunite them, because there was so much force for good that they did together. Doge certainly was a great example, I think, of allowing for people who would never be part of the federal government, but for a small stint that they could do. And again, the federal laws are so clunky when it comes to hiring someone for a defined period of time. It's just hard to do. But Elon Musk was able to bring in some of the brightest minds in the world from the private sector, people who weren't doing this for money, glory, or fame, but really doing it because they believed in the mission and the cause. And Elon Musk spearheaded that and was able to root out a lot of things that the government wasn't aware of when it comes to waste, fraud, abuse, efficiency, inefficiency. And so I think President Trump certainly lauded him for that. I think where it came down to was, personalities, which is understandable when you're dealing with people surrounding the president. But I think Elon always had the best interest of our country at heart. And I think a lot of people continue to believe that. So I hope that he stays active and involved. Obviously, he has his own financial interests and, boards that are looking at what he's doing and what he's saying. So hopefully it all works out in the end.
Okay, and just lastly, Amanda, and briefly, if you will, I mean, we've here at Arabiya English, a top story for us all week has really been focusing on President Trump's 20-point plan to bring about a conclusion to the war in Gaza and a framework for peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis. I mean, how much of a top story has that been in the United States? Is that what a lot of newspapers, news shows have been leading with?
Well, unfortunately, a lot of this was the culmination of it happened right around the time of a government shutdown. So obviously that is front and center right now in the United States. Everyone's focused on when does our government reopen? Of course, what happens in the Middle East has always been an important point when you have a crucible in the Middle East that people are always worried about what's happening, but it's not front and center in the United States. I think this comes down to, for Netanyahu, does Hamas accept or not accept? And what does he do in those two scenarios? I think it's very difficult to see how this is not going to be a challenge for Netanyahu if Hamas does accept, because he's at a critical time right now in his own reelection. The polling numbers are not good for him. He needs the help of his conservative base, and he has to sell the conservative base on this in his own country. And so I think it's a challenging thing for him, but it's great to see 8 Arab and Muslim nations that are in support of this. And hopefully Hamas will agree to the terms. I think the hardest part for Hamas is going to be that clause 17, where they basically say, no matter what Hamas does, we're still going to go in and do the humanitarian aid, and we're still going to go in and clean up what we have to with Hamas. So Hamas is in a tight spot, but hopefully enough Arab and Muslim countries' influence and Western influence will make all the difference for them to engage, and hopefully we see a new world order there.
All right. Well, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure talking to you, Republican strategist and lawyer Amanda Mackey. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
Thank you, Tom.
Well, that is all we have time for on Global News today. Thank you very much indeed for watching. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow with a look back at some of the best interviews of the week. Until then, goodbye.